Our second keynote speaker is Professor Daniel Messenger. It's great to have you here today, Daniel. Thank you very much. And,
Thank you.
Dr. Messenger is a professor of psychology, pediatrics, electrical and computer engineering, music engineering at University of Miami. He is an interdisciplinary developmental psychologist who investigates the temporal dynamics of communication to understand infants and children's social, emotional, and language development. He uses machine learning to paint an objective picture of children's interaction and employs computational models to make sense of the resulting behavioral data. Dr. Messenger works with children affected by autism spectrum disorder, hearing loss, and poverty. I would like to thank Daniel again and leave the stage to him for his talk entitled Data-Driven Development, Objective Measurement of Early Interaction.
Thank you, Hamdi. Thank you, Atir. Thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure to share some more of our work with you. What I thought I'd do in the keynote is contextualize our work in classroom interaction by first talking about its development, its beginnings, influenced by both Beatrice and Jeff, looking at emotion and interaction dynamics. Then we'll transfer to the questions of autism and autism spectrum disorder, looking at behavior imaging of autism spectrum disorder, so what the IBIS stands for, and then get back to our questions of classroom interaction in which children spend so much of their time. And in all of these domains, ask what behavior imaging, that is objective measurement of behavior via this community, what light that can shed on both behavior and development by using computational models. So an emphasis both on imaging and on modeling. I'd like to start in part where Dr. Jan left us, where Jan left us, looking at the Duchenne smile. So in the top row of photos, you'll see an infant displaying increasing intensity of smile in the mouth, and at the same time, increasing intensity of eye constriction, AU6, the Duchenne marker. What I also want to show you is this cry face, this baby that's becoming more and more distressed. And at the same time, I'm going to argue that eye constriction typically becomes more and more intense in the case of negative emotion as well. So to look at that, we employed active appearance models. There was a Laplacian transformation of both the appearance and shape features. And we looked at the levels of intensity using support vector machines. And at the same time, we asked observers to rate the positive or negative affect of the infants, completely naive. We got individual ratings via a joystick method like Jeff's karma, and got a mean rating there. And I'll be talking about the interrelationship of those signals. So here we find that during smiles, smile intensity predicts positive emotion perception. During those smiles, the degree of eye constriction, the degree, predicts the degree of positive emotion perceived. And here's the really new part. During the cry face, eye constriction also predicts the negative emotional valence, which is perceived. So greater eye constriction during a cry face makes the face look more negative. We also did this in a more experimental protocol, the face-to-face still face. So first the mom plays with the baby as she normally would at home. This is like what Dr. Beebe was showing. There, the proportion of smiles that were accompanied by the eye constriction by the Duchenne marker was higher than it was during the still face. Now, during the still face, the mom has stopped interacting. She's holding a still face or a poker face, and that's stressful for the baby because the baby's not getting anything back or very little. And there, the proportion of negative cry face expressions involving that same eye constriction marker, that same Duchenne marker, increases. So this double dissociation led us to posit that there is both a Duchenne smile and a Duchenne distress marker. You know, I should have put that in. We've also done this work using avatars who are showing sad expressions and showing them to adults. So we have some parallels there as well. And here, of course, we're looking at a particular behavioral domain, facial expression, but we're really looking at how the infant is behaving. With Jeff and Vincent Chu, we broadened our scope to look at both infant and mother. And this is really a data-driven branch and bound approach. And we're asking in the video of both the infant and the mom, are there shape features that are coincident, that parallel one another? Can we find them in different frames in the video? And ultimately, it provides us a basis for suggesting, hold on to your seats, that the smile is our common communication signal, but really building it up from the video itself, from features of the video itself, rather than assuming them. So with the smile as a common behavioral signal within the mother-infant dyad, we applied that to actual interactions. And here, what you're seeing is the intensity of the mother's smile here. And this is a Duchenne smile, the mom's in red, the baby's in blue. Baby coming down, so baby decreasing her smile faster than mom is decreasing her smile. So we get this stage that we often do, in which the baby is kind of self-regulating and mom continues to smile. And a little uptick in baby smile here, and that will be all it will take, we were talking about contingency, for the mom to increase her smile there. So this is a way to employ the techniques in the field to understand what affective communication might look like continuously or dynamically. We did not objectively measure those smiles, so it's not quite multimodal yet. It's more facial here. To explore those communication dynamics that we were talking about, the changes in the degree of Duchenne smiling, we turned back to the subjective measures of the raters. So they're producing these together, they rate separately, but together as a group, they produce these mean affective valence contours of parent in blue and infant in green separately. Seaman Chow has now modeled those data to ask, well, how is the parent's previous state influencing the infant's current state? I think through state-space modeling is able to show, how that level of influence actually changes in time. So this is important because we often think, well, this dyad has a high level of synchrony or a low level of synchrony, but we know as human beings that one's level of responsivity, as shown here, is actually changing continuously in time. So we need to integrate these dynamic features of interaction to get a fuller picture of what's going on. This is the same, this is a inverse optimal control approach in which we're taking the description of what happens when baby smiles, does mother smile, what happens when mother smiles, does baby smile, how long does it take for baby to smile, when does baby start smiling and stop smiling? And we're asking, given that observed interaction, what are the likelihood of certain posited goals on the part of infant or mother? What's their posterior probability given the data? And this is a new view of the dyads in my view. And what we find is that mothers act to create and extend epochs of interaction which both they and the baby are smiling. You can imagine that, interacting with a baby. But babies are less interested in those epochs. Babies instead are interested in maximizing the amount of time in which mother is smiling and they're not smiling, sort of a smile in state. And this is all a way, of course, of taking data and inferring potential goals, asking what communication goals might be, which I think was also evident in Beatrice's talk. Now, a classic way to do that is in the still phase. So you'll remember that in the still phase, the parent tries not to interact. And what we find is that the baby's gaze at the parent's face during the still phase, it begins high. The baby would like interaction, but then it decreases as it decreases logarithmically as the baby receives no interaction, receives no response from the part of the baby. And the degree to which it does so corresponds with the infant later attachment security. So Beatrice talked about attachment security. So avoidant babies who are avoidant later in the strange situation, which I'll show you in just a bit, when their gaze declines precipitously. They stop trying to contact the parent. They figure, the parent's not available to me. Resistant babies hardly decline at all. That's the slope of the line. So they continue to try to message the parent even though the parent is not responding. And then infants who will turn out to be secure in the still phase show a middle pattern. I also want to put in this, replication does happen. This is a very large sample of mother-infant dyads. They were coded manually, in this case, using a system that incorporates multiple behavioral modalities. So we lose some detail, but we do get an overall picture. And what we find is an effect of maternal responsivity, but in the context of a quadratic effect. This is something Beatrice has been talking about for a while, in which very high levels of responsivity, the contingency that Jeff and Beatrice were talking about, the overly contingent moms who are responding to the baby, as well as mothers who, in Beatrice's words, stonewall the baby and don't respond, that those levels of responsivity were associated with higher proportions of disorganized attachment, in which the infants really did not have a coherent attachment plan. So I've talked about different ways in which rich dyadic communication patterns can be quantified and used to predict outcomes. I want to talk now about that outcome. So this is the classic strange situation. Mom was outside the room. She's now walking in the room. That's baby. We're using these connects to track each participant's face. You can see that in the bounding boxes. There are 4 connects in use here. And this is the distance between the two. So they're getting close here, but baby is moving away. That's baby's velocity. Baby stops and then begins slowly to crawl towards the mom and decrease this distance. Mom's head is being tracked by another connect here. So we're able to quantify using these simple methods the degree of distance between the two. And we'll take those features and ask questions about them. And this research is really designed to, in classical attachment theory, one is only looking at the infant's behavior in the strange situation. But what we actually find is that, that it's true, there are dyadic measures, so how close the two are, the duration of their contact is associated with this approach avoidance dimension of attachment. The degree to which the infant approaches the mom right away, which our child was so on in that video, is also associated with greater approach and lower avoidance. But the degree to which the mother moved away from the baby, that negatively approaches experts' perception of approach and ratings of approach on the part of the infant. So both infant and mother are involved in the stance, even in an assessment that is thought to be a measurement purely of the infant. So just the bottom line observation, it is important to objectively observe behavior to see what is producing outcomes. In that vein, I want to turn to autism, also called autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. BIAS stands for Behavior Imaging of Autism for Science. So to talk a little bit about that, autism is a developmental disorder that affects the nonverbal communication that we've been talking about, where an infant or child looks, their facial expressions, how they use proxemics, and it's a rather impactful disorder that impacts children's peer relationships. To look at the development of autism, we look at the younger siblings, the baby siblings, high-risk siblings. They're high risk because they have an older brother or sister with an ASD. So the question is, will they themselves have an ASD? Because ASD is common, particularly among the males, but also among the female younger siblings. So this gives us a context for looking at the emergence of the disorder. If we turn back to that strange situation, you know, we were tracking the two, so that was a nice approach there. But here we're looking at vocalizations as measured with Lino software, which is in fact is a Gaussian mixture model, so a kind of old school approach. Here we're just looking, we use those recordings, but we measured the fundamental frequency of cries when the parent was outside of the room. Those tended to be elevated in the case of infants who were going on to an autism spectrum disorder. So objective measurement of the early behavior in a social situation of high-risk siblings may be able to reveal patterns suggestive of the emergence of autism. Here we're showing the same thing in the face-to-face procedure. Here looking at face-to-face interaction. There's a still face here, and then there's a reunion in which the parent is asked to play again with the infant. We'd like to see high levels of smiling in the beginning. Those might decline somewhat, as in this low-risk case after the still face. What we find in the case of ASD, of infants going on to an ASD, is low levels of initial smiling that remain low, but don't decrease further, almost as if they were impervious to the still face itself. With Zakia Hamal and Jeff, following on Beatrice's suggestion, we looked at the yaw, pitch, and roll of rigid motion, so of the mom's head motion and the baby's head motion and these dyadic interactions. So here we are tracking mom and baby and find different patterns of association between overall levels of the angular velocity of pitch and roll in these interactions. So we're looking at the degree to which overall levels of pitch and roll velocity are associated between the two members of the dyad and finding differences in their developmental outcome. We also looked at this to really individuate where autism behaviors were more manifest. These are older children. They're looking either at a non-social stimulus like a screensaver or a social stimulus, a little drama about a birthday party. And this is a child without autism. So the angular velocity of yaw and roll are decreased in the case of the social stimulus with respect to a child with autism, in which there's higher levels. But these higher levels, which might be a form of kind of self-regulation of the child's ability to attend to this video by creating these perception action loops, that is evident only in the social, but not in the non-social case. So you can see that nice little interaction there. So again, these are older children with autism. You might ask how they were identified. So we, with Amy Yojin looked at this autism assessment instrument, the ADOS, which she talked about earlier today, looking both at the audio signal and using affectiva that we discussed. And as you recall, there are moderate associations between social smiles and degree of autism symptoms. So higher symptoms, you want those lines to go down. Higher symptoms, lower levels of behaviors, also evident in the vocal domain in terms of the child's turn-taking, vocal turn-taking with both the examiner and the parent. And what's emerging here, it's a hard sample to work with. Oh, I'm sorry, those correlations came out white here. What's emerging here, but the sample is hard to work with, is that the kids without ASD show lower levels. But it remains to be seen whether the lines have different slopes or not. And in general, I would say here that the associations we find with facial expression per se are not as strong as those of facial expression that's more directed at the adult, and we are working to use more other methods, more modern methods to look at gaze during this situation. Okay, turning to interactive behavior in schools. The title of the presentation, which I think we've given some context to. We call this the IBIS paper. That's the IBIS project. That's the acronym. This is an IBIS. It's a water bird. The IBIS is wearing a vest. The vest is instrumented with objective measurement devices. So the basic issue here is that if you think about a classroom and you send in an expert rater, right? They can rate the degree of dyadic play here, the degree of imaginative play of this child making lunch. But while we're focusing on her, we might miss that there's a parade of people walking on stilts behind her. We can only focus on one or maybe two kids at a time. They're making lunch, they're interacting a little bit, but later on, there are going to be people who are racing cars behind them. So each child is having their own experience within the same context. So how can we capture the richness of those experiences and behaviors? So our first look at that was using this Lena device. So first person audio. Here's the little vest that the IBIS that the bird was wearing. And what we find here, the Gaussian mixture models identify whether the target child is speaking or whether their peers are speaking. Peer vocalizations on a given day are associated with child vocalizations on that day over multiple days in the classroom. And these are kids with general developmental delays, all in one classroom together. And in fact, the level of peer vocalizations are associated with increases in vocabulary as assessed by the teacher in the classroom. So that's great. Peers seem to be influencing language development based on audio, but audio cannot tell us who's interacting with whom, which child is interacting with the others. So there we introduce again this ultra wide radio frequency identification. It's happening, this is the Lena vest again. And here we have the tags, which are emitting the radios, which are the radio waves, which are detected by 4 sensors in the corners of the classroom. So it's multimodal in the sense that we have location orientation and audio. I'll just mention briefly again that a key issue here is when is social contact happening? So we're looking for distances, radii here, between all pairs of children, which are higher than you'd expect given chance, where chance is the level, the distance of any child to all other children in the classroom over all times. That is their individual location proclivities. If each child has a heat map of where they tend to be, and you ask over all those distances, that's kind of chance. Whereas here, we're observing 2 children together. We ask how often the children appear in those radii with respect to chance. And the answer is they tend to not be very close together. This medium distance tends to be elevated, and at larger distances, we get, as we'd expect, a pattern close to chance. So again, the inference is these children are likely to be in interaction, whereas these 2 children are unlikely to be in interaction. This is it in an inclusion classroom. So to say a little bit more, inclusion classrooms are designed to educate children, in this case with hearing loss, the blue kids, with children without hearing loss, with typically developing peers. And that's what's going on here. And when the triangles are filled in, one child is talking. So we have a multimodal representation of what's going on. We apply our G of R to identify a distance criterion of social contact. We also ask that the two children be oriented towards one another within 45 degrees, as shown here. And this is a visualization of the relative orientation of all pairs of children in the classroom. And there are 3 classrooms summarized here. This is Lynn Perry's work. Lynn co-directs this classroom social interaction IBIS project with me. And what we find is that if you go into the classroom and observe at a given time and ask how many peer vocalizations in social contact does one child get from a given peer, that predicts the amount of time that they will speak to that peer in social contact at the next observation. Observations could have been a week apart, they could have been a month apart. It turned out to be robust. It didn't really make a difference. So children are actually engaging in a reciprocal pattern of A vocalizes to B vocalizes to A over weeks and months. You can also ask more complex questions about the vocalizations, about the audio signal. So here we're looking at Sphinx. It's using a Markov model to detect phonemic richness. That is the mean number of speech sounds that are occurring per utterance. And this is Yudong Tao's work, and he's working in conjunction with Sam Mitzvin. What Sam shows is that overall, so not asking for social contact, but just overall, the phonemic richness of teacher speech is associated with the phonemic richness of children's speech. And the phonemic richness is higher for typical hearing kids than for kids with hearing loss. And I'll just mention again, the kids have hearing loss, but they also have cochlear implants. So they have some degree of access to the audio environment. The question is, how does that impact their language development? And here we're seeing a signal there in the context of this interactive effect here with teachers. What Sam showed is that if you look at the beginning and end of the semester, of the year, teacher phonemic diversity predicts child phonemic diversity, which in turn predicts language ability. I'm showing receptive, but it was also true for expressive language. And the real power here is that the complexity of the children's speech predicts their assessed language ability at the end of the year. So actual real-time interaction, again, is affecting development. So why do we look so carefully at how behavior happens, how interaction occurs? Because it affects children's development. Here we are in the case of autism. Now the blue triangles, we're looking at orientation as well, are children with autism. You can see they're more likely to be among themselves here. These are typically developing kids. There's some degree, perhaps, in which they interact amongst themselves, although this kid is moving a bit around them. But of course, we want to look at this quantitatively. We use our GR criterion again. These are, of course, a different set of classes, and also that 45-degree criterion for social contact. Again, 2 effects. So one is modularity. Focusing on these kids, children with ASD are more likely to be at the outskirts of social groups. They have a less rich set of connections among themselves than do their typically developing peers, where connections are the degree over the entire set of observations that these children spoke to one another in social contact. Moreover, if you total up each child's level of speech with all other children, and only the high weights are shown here. But if you total that up for this child and for this child, what you find is that the degree centrality, or weighted degree centrality here, predicts those final language assessments that we were talking about. So this relationship between real-time interaction with peers is manifest both here in the case of autism spectrum disorder and in the previous slides in the case of hearing loss. Another quick look at this, we can also look at children's continuous movement toward and away from each other. So a continuous measure of approach. Here we're factoring in both the kind of Euclidean approach, but also one child's orientation towards another that we're not showing. Approach is complicated. We're factoring not only their orientation, but the orientation of their movement, which are two separate dimensions. When we look at all of that, what we find is a greater fluidity, a greater velocity of movement, both toward and away, both are operative, among typically developing children with other typically developing children. We see a decrement in those blue kids, in the kids with ASD, in moving toward and away from each other. But we also find that children, typically developing children, see the little arrow, move toward their peers with ASD less quickly, for example, than they move towards their typically developing peers. And the children with ASD also move towards their typically developing peers. There's a decrement if the dyad involves a child with ASD, although a kind of note of positivity here is that if both kids have ASD, there is a decrement from the typical case, but the decrement is not particularly pronounced. And there is actually a hint of that in the literature, albeit with much older folks, adolescents and so on. That, you know, part of the problem is the social deficit of the child with ASD is also how they're perceived by other people. So when they're both interacting together, it's not terribly fluid, but it's not more impaired than it is with a typically developing child. And as we talked about last time, at the same time, the children with ASD approach their teachers more quickly than their typically developing peers and are in fact approached by their teachers more quickly than their typically developing peers. So to sum up, we're leveraging objective measurement, additional modeling of those measures and of standard measures to better understand and improve outcomes for children with ASD, children with hearing loss, and children with other developmental disorders. And with that, I just want to underline again that this is, of course, takes a village. So here's one lab, and here's Lynn Perry's lab. We're working in concert. We have funding from a variety of sources, and we want to thank as well all the folks who participate in this research and allow it to occur. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. So thank you very much for the interesting and informative talk. And we have still 5-6 minutes for questions, for some discussion. Do we have any questions?
So Daniel, I really love your work. I mean, it's beautiful to get such an overview, and you're involved in so many gorgeous projects. You know, one thing that I really liked was your first, as you can imagine, I really liked how you were modeling the still face. Can you hear me?
I can. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I don't have much control, but I can hear you fine.
Okay.
You're doing a still face.
Yeah, I mean, how rapidly you stop looking, I found that finding so fascinating.
Yeah.
And it predicts attachment so clearly. That's just amazing.
Yeah. So I would say that theoretically, it's a great finding. To be careful, there are differences in the attachment groups in those slopes, in the degree to which they decrease. So overall, I would say that we do find associations between interaction and still face behavior and later attachment. They're not always as strong as we'd like. They're not always where we'd expect them.
Mm-hmm. But do you like that measure, how rapidly you stop looking?
Yeah, I do like it. And in fact, I think I should look at it again in different data sets. Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like a great measure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm glad you like it.
I like all the work.
Yeah, I mean, you're doing such a kind of a range of, areas and modalities. I mean, it's really kind of tour de force. One of the things I was wondering about is when you measure orientation, since that's like, such a key variable in some of the autism studies, how do you measure like within 45 degrees? Is it the orientation of the body? Is it the orientation of the head? What does it mean to be oriented towards someone?
Sure. So in the classroom studies, I don't really think I can show you the slides anymore. In the classroom studies, remember each kid has a sensor basically on their hips.
Yeah.
So it's their relationship is determining orientation, is determining body orientation. So at a given moment, they have a particular set of angles with respect,
Right.
absolutely in the classroom, and then with respect to any peer.
Yeah. Do you think if you had like, sensors on their head, apart from the fact whether that's feasible or not, but if you did, would the story look differently? I mean, what's your sense?
Yeah, I mean, of course, we'd love to have sensors on their heads. It's also true when we do have sensors on when we are tracking their heads, like in the strange situations, we'd also like to be tracking their bodies. I imagine it would give us a richer picture because you would get children looking at one another, and we're not getting that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I guess you might ask, well, how, what's the temporal, what are the temporal dynamics? Like if I look like this and I'm a 4-year-old, how long do I look like this before I turn?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the sensor data is giving you sociometrics in the classroom, because you're looking at relationships over time, and often we just look at we look at interactions, right? Either kind of a person or a dyad at one moment in time, but you're looking at, it looked like you were looking across months.
Yeah, we are looking across months. So an advantage of working in the classrooms is there's like a captive audience.
Yeah.
We can go back and we develop those relationships. And in fact, with respect to sociometrics, we have a paper by Altman et al. That shows that this measure of speech and social contact is associated with teacher ratings of the children's sociality. And the second semester is associated with the children's ratings of their own friendships. So you can look at it at both an individual and a dyadic level, and both show some signal there.
Yeah, very cool.
Okay, so we have a last question from Albert.
Yep. More of a comment, actually. There is a very recent work by Chris Kitani's group on a wearable that is worn on the body, but it includes a fisheye camera and can detect the head pose from the underneath underside of the head. Perhaps that could be a useful prop.
That sounds great. How do you spell the last name of the research?
I'll just paste the link in the chat window if you can see the chat.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks a lot, Daniel, again, for the nice talk. Now it is time for a break, and we will meet in 20 minutes again.